Objects of great antiquity from the distant past are typically cherished and studied. For some, recovering and discovering these relics can be a rewarding process. Uncovering the mystery of how our ancestors had once lived thousands of years before us can become a fascinating and noble pursuit of knowledge and history. Though, there are times when digging in the dirt can unearth objects that really should remain buried. In this episode, we discover what happens when two of these ancient relics finally see the light of day once more. Welcome back to Moonlight Lore. As always, I'm your host, Jordan Hopkins. As I said in the opening, this episode will revolve around the dangers of unearthing relics of the past. But more specifically, the two stone-carved relics two young boys in Hexham, England recovered from their backyard several years ago in 1971. The two boys in question were 8-year-old Leslie and his older brother, 11-year-old Colin Robson. Both were a part of an unremarkable family, living a peaceful and quiet life in a brick townhouse of Hexham, North England, a small town located just a quick 30-minute drive west of Newcastle. The two boys had been sent outside by their mother, possibly to give her a moment of peace, and instructed them to either spend their time outdoors playing or by doing chores. Whatever was the case, both Colin and Leslie found themselves in their backyard garden that day, digging up weeds, or possibly using their imagination for a game of sorts. The two had been digging for a little while, going through several inches of dirt, when they stumbled upon something they hadn't expected. The two boys standing over the hole they had just dug stared down in wonderment. Covered in brown dirt were a pair of round stones, both of which had been carved into two rudimentary human faces. They weren't very large, about the size of someone's palm, and maybe a little smaller than that of a tennis ball. In many of our youths, this has been a dream, randomly picking and digging a spot and discovering something incredibly weird and what could be valuable. Well, the two boys, probably with a non-delicate touch and more so of pure excitement, grabbed the two stone heads from their resting place in the garden and rushed inside the house to show their mother. Surprised at their find, their mother took the two stone heads and inspected them carefully. They were strange little things, and she thought maybe if they had been buried in the ground, they could have been quite old, and was probably best to take them away from the two young boys until she could find out their origin. The unexpressive heads weren't created by any master stone carver. They were rather basic in design. Both had rather pointy noses and had stumpy little necks which hinted towards having been a part of larger piece such as a stone body or small pedestal. But to Mrs. Robson, she didn't really know what to make of the two heads, so she simply placed them out of reach and hid them away from the boys until she could contact someone who might have had a clue about their origins. So for the time being, the stone heads sat on the shelf in the Robsons' living room for the rest of the day, ominously watching over the family as they went about their daily routine. It wasn't until around sundown that strange activity began to take place in the household. Things that could not be explained and were beginning to get out of control. As the small family was gathering in the living room to enjoy each other's company for the evening, one of them spotted movement from the corner of their eye. On a high shelf in the living room sat the heads, but now both were turned from how they sat when Mrs. Robson placed them there. Puzzled, she got up and walked to them, intending on fixing their position. But when she reached out to grab one, just inches away from it, the head seemed to repel from her hand without her even touching it. Quite startled, she took a few steps back and away from the shelf, staring at the heads. When she turned around to tell her husband what had just happened, Mr. Robson looked up at her, but saw the heads behind her both shake and move ever so slightly to turn and look at him. Both were quite disturbed with this development, but chalked it up to it being late and both being tired. It was weird, but maybe they were just seeing things. The family began settling in for the night, though the thought of the stone heads downstairs still unnerved Mrs. Robson. She was discussing the heads with her husband while the pair were getting under the covers of their bed when the two heard a couple of loud bangs from the main floor. Mrs. Robson, being on edge from the movement of the heads, instantly sat upright in bed, gripping her husband's arm. She instructed him to venture out of bed and down the stairs to investigate and ensure it wasn't one of the boys or girls still up at this hour, and to make sure everything was alright downstairs. Probably with a bit of an eye roll, Mr. Robson headed down the old staircase to find the lights were still turned off, and everything was the way they had been when he and his wife left just 10 minutes ago. Flicking on the light to make sure though, he looked around the living room and kitchen and found nothing out of the ordinary. He was about to head back upstairs to head back to bed, but as he neared the stairs again, he felt his foot kick something solid. He looked down and found his foot had hit one of the small stone heads, now sitting on the floor looking up at him. Maybe a bit confused, he picked it up and looked at it. It was as unremarkable as it had been when he last saw it, so he thought perhaps one of the children had simply placed it by the stairs as a prank, or perhaps the head had fallen and rolled into where it sat on the floor. Still staring at his strange little face, he approached the shelf and placed it where it should have been. But when setting it down, he found the second one was missing too. Wondering where that one might have gone now, he turned around to search for it, but it didn't take long. Almost instantly, his eyes locked onto the second head, sitting on the coffee table in the middle of the room, staring right back at him. Probably a bit startled, he didn't even bother walking over and putting the head back in its place on the shelf, and rather immediately retreated up the stairs. The next day, things were calm in the Robson household. The heads would occasionally move and face other directions, but during the day, things were more or less quiet. It seemed only to be at night did unexplainable things continue to happen around the house. Though knocking could be heard throughout the rooms, and scratching sounds in the walls were a common occurrence during the day. At night, the heads would move about the house on their own accord, eventually leading the members of the family having to look for them each and every morning. But it wasn't until a couple days into their ordeal that whatever presence that was brought into the house would become more destructive. Pretty soon, plates and glasses were being thrown around the house, shattering against the walls. Heavier furniture like chairs or lamps would start to fall over, or move as if pushed by something invisible. And one night, one of the members of the family witnessed a faint glowing light coming from the garden where the two heads were found. All this paranormal activity continued to ramp up, but things didn't get too out of hand at this point. Sure, these things moving around the house were slight annoyances, but overall, the family got used to them pretty quick and found themselves wondering every day what strange thing would happen next. But the fun wasn't to last, and the two daughters of the family on multiple nights found some of the broken glass from the shattered plates and glasses lying in their beds. Then soon after, both parents began developing excruciating headaches that would last for hours every time they set foot in the house. It became clear the longer the heads were in the house, the worse things would get. But it wasn't until about a week into the Stonehead stay did the most bizarre activities start to occur. What would go on to make this case famous actually happened next door from the Robsons in their neighbor's home. The Dodds were unaware of the strangeness happening just next door to them in the Robsons' house. They had very little reason to expect they would become the victims to a horrifying entity that would visit them, seemingly due to the unearthing of the heads. The Dodd family experienced the occasional activity as well during the week the heads were in the Robsons. The Dodd's daughter was subjected to random abuse by having her hair pulled by an invisible entity. Certain items in the house would also seemingly move all on their own, and doors were seen to have opened and closed without anybody being near them. But for the Dodds, the most terrifying moment wouldn't come until the end of the week, when Mrs. Dodd had been upstairs with her daughter late one evening, getting ready for a night of sleep, when the door to the bedroom slowly creaked open, and a dark figure walked into the room in front of them. A half-man, half-beast as they described it, walked on all 4 feet into the bedroom, looking directly into their eyes. There was no pause or suspense between who would react first. Both Mrs. Dodd and her daughter both let out an incredible scream of terror at the creature, which, maybe to their surprise, didn't run away as they expected it to from the loud noise. The creature, still making eye contact with them, simply walked slowly backwards through the bedroom door, down the staircase, and disappeared into the shadowy dark of the main floor. all while never turning around. It was only the two at home this evening, and both were very hesitant on leaving the room to investigate or to get to the phone to call for help. The two waited for nearly 20 minutes before Mrs. Dodd told her daughter to stay in the room while she mustered up the courage to venture downstairs to see if she could reach the phone or see if that creature had finally left. As she listened intently while on her descent down the stairs, she came to the bottom to find the front door wide open, the chain lock still swinging from the doorframe. While recounting her horrifying experience, Mrs. Dodd claimed the creature that stood before her and her daughter in the bedroom looked to be half man, half goat hybrid, and that she got the feeling it came into her house looking for something specific, but left when it couldn't find what it was seeking. Hearing the news of their neighbor's strange encounter and the paranormal activity they experienced, the Robsons knew they needed to get rid of the heads. They didn't want to destroy them because they believed by doing so, they might upset or unleash whatever spirit or spirits that possessed them. Perhaps the best course of action was to find someone who could truly find their origin and history so that they might be able to find a solution. It took some time, but the Robsons were able to get into contact with Dr. Anne Ross, an expert on Celtic artifacts who was quite eager to get her hands on the two heads after hearing what had happened to the Dodds and from the stories of paranormal happenings in the Robsons' household. With her help, the heads became rather quite famous in Hexham. For the most part, the Robsons had kept the stone heads to themselves for a majority of the time they had them, not necessarily broadcasting their existence to the whole town, but also not hiding them either. Pretty soon, after Dr. Ross had obtained them, the stone heads were the talk of the town, making an appearance onto the local newspaper and local TV news broadcasts, highlighting the events of what took place in the Dodds and Robsons' homes. Curious enough, for most who saw the pictures and looked upon the heads in the flesh, described the two as having male and female characteristics about them, despite their basic design. The male head depicting that of a younger boy, with what looked like molded stripes that resembled hair, and the woman being described less than desirable, as many have described her as like an old hag with large bulging eyes and a beak-like nose. However, these strangely designed heads weren't something Dr. Ross was entirely familiar with, but she did conclude they were of Celtic origin, but to how ancient she would have no exact idea, and could only make an educated guess of being around 1,800 years old, but to get an exact date, she would need to send them off to a lab for tests. In the meantime, while she conducted her research and investigated the possible history behind the heads, she kept them on a shelf in her home upstairs in her study. As one could have expected, by doing so, she had welcomed whatever spirit that possessed these stones into her home. And it wasn't long before Dr. Ross would experience her own version of paranormal activity, similar to that of the Robson and Dodd families. Just like the previous families, the activity in the Ross's house escalated quickly, and within a week of the stone heads being in her home, her and her family would experience an abundance of horrors. Again, just like in the previous homes, random small events took place. Small items would move unexpectedly, right in front of the eyes of Dr. Ross and her family. Little things similar to this would go on for a while in their home, until one night at around 2 a.m., Anne was awoken from her sleep by a bitter cold that was blanketing her bedroom, and the feeling of something standing at the edge of her bed, watching her sleep. She slowly opened her groggy eyes and looked up to see a frightening figure standing between her bed and the doorway. She's quoted saying, "It was about 6 feet high, slightly stooping, and it was black against a white door, and it was half animal, half man. The upper part, I would have said, was a wolf, and the lower part was human, and I would have said again that it was covered with a kind of black, very dark fur. It went out, and I just saw it clearly, and then it disappeared, and something made me run after it, a thing I wouldn't normally have done, but I felt compelled to run after it. I got out of bed and I ran, and I could hear it going down the stairs. Then it disappeared towards the back of the house." End quote. A couple days after this incident, Anne's daughter also claimed to have seen a wolf-man creature in her house when she had come home from school one day. When she entered the house through the front door, she came face to face with a dark, shadowy werewolf, as she described it, standing on top of the staircase, staring down at her. Before she could scream or even back up through the front door, the creature bolted halfway down the stairs towards her and leapt over the banister to run towards the back of the house, where it disappeared around a corridor. By the time her parents came home that evening, she was crying in hysterics, begging for them to do something about the strange things happening around the house. This was what most likely was the final straw for the Rosses, as Anne firmly believed these daily occurrences of paranormal activity were 100% caused by the stone head she had recently brought into her home. So, taking a note of how the Robsons were able to get rid of the ghost from their house, Anne did the same thing. She transferred not only the 2 stone heads she was given by the Robsons, but also her whole collection of other stone head artifacts she had accumulated over the past several decades, and passed them on to other collectors and researchers. The famous stone heads of Hexham, however, managed to find their way to the British Museum, where for a short time they sat on display, but quickly, for unknown reasons, were taken down and stored away out of the public sight, collecting nothing but dust and cobwebs. Many people believe the museum itself experienced its own form of paranormal activity, hence the hiding away of the stone heads. But whatever was the case, the heads seemed to have moved around quite a bit, and were passed along to numerous experts and researchers. They ended up in the care of the Museum of Antiquities in Newcastle University, and also made an appearance in Southampton, where they were studied and tested thoroughly. After an analysis by Professor Dearman of the University of Newcastle had been done, he believed the heads to have been artificially molded by someone's hands rather than carved from solid rock by a chisel method. Though, with this analysis, he was unable to come up with any sort of date they could have been crafted. Now that the heads were gone and being taken care of by experts, the people who had come into contact with them were left to wonder, what really was the origin of those heads, and what were those half-man, half-beast creatures looking for? Unfortunately, the mystery behind the heads would go unsolved. Whatever these creatures were, or what the purpose behind the heads were, would continue to go unknown for several years. But it was in 1972, a year after the head's initial discovery by the 2 boys Leslie and Colin, did a man by the name of Desmond Craigie come forth to possibly shed some light on the history of the heads. He had claimed that he had lived in the Robsons' home 16 years prior to the boys finding the heads back in 1956, and had crafted the heads for his daughter to play with. At the time, he had worked at a construction company and had used concrete, sand, and water to mold 3 heads. One had been lost since the very beginning, but the other 2, which were found by the 2 brothers, had been buried and lost in the garden. In an interview with the Evening Chronicle News, Desmond is quoted saying, "I made them about 16 years ago. I had made the heads from bits of stone and mortar simply to amuse my daughter when she was a little girl. I actually made 3, but one appears to have gotten lost. They were out in the garden for years, but I definitely made them. I have been laughing my head off about these heads, and I cannot understand why all this attention is being paid to them." End quote. When asked if he could possibly replicate the stone heads, since he had been able to sculpt them from the simple concrete, Desmond, to his credit, happily obliged and did so. Though many people were quick to point out that his replicas weren't as skillfully crafted as the famous ones everyone had been talking about for the past year. But with little else to determine their origins, how old they were, or what else they could have been meant for, Desmond Craigie's explanation might be the only one we have to go on at the moment. Any further study or examination of the stone heads are quite simply impossible to this day, as through the exchange of so many hands of researchers attempting to answer the previous questions, the stone heads mysteriously disappeared. To this day, nobody knows where the stone heads of Hexham ended up. Some believe the paranormal activity became too much for one of the researchers and they destroyed them. Or perhaps they were taken home and are sitting on someone's mantle above their fireplace. What most people hope for is with the constant traveling and shipping of the heads, they had simply gotten lost in the mail and will one day return and show up on a doorstep somewhere. But until that happens, we are left to wonder what made the people of Hexham, and eventually most of Britain, to become so focused on these otherwise unremarkable heads. According to Hexham history, nearly 70 years prior, the town was besieged by a ferocious large grey wolf that had broken free from a nearby zoo. The wolf was named the Wolf of Allendale, after the town where the wolf was found dead outside of. Both towns, Hexham and Allendale, were dealing with this monstrous predator for around 3 weeks as it hunted and slaughtered an incredible number of sheep during this period. Things had actually gotten so out of control, farmers were forced to hide their livestock indoors to protect them from the wolf's wrath, and multiple search parties for the wolf were sent out, but all of them failed to capture or kill the beast. Even a reward of £5 had been announced for the man who could put an end to the rampage and slaughtering, and in today's currency that would have equaled to just about around £600, but still, nobody would claim the bounty. It wasn't until the end of December, after dealing with the wolf for a whole month, would a party of hunters eventually find the remains of a strange-looking animal cut in 2 halves after being thrown nearly 40 feet by a passing train. By this point, a whole committee had been formed to deal with the wolf, and after seeing the body, confirmed this carcass was indeed the fully grown male wolf that terrorized the 2 communities. Though there was somebody who objected to this claim. The owner of the wolf, Captain Bain of Shortley Bridge, looked over the dead body of the creature, and announced this one was much smaller than the wolf that had escaped his small zoo, and that the real wolf was still on the prowl. Many people, 70 years later when the heads were dug up, were quick to drudge up the past and blame the strange occurrences of sightings of a half-man, half-goat creature seen in the Dodds house and a half-man, half-wolf man witnessed by Dr. Ross and her daughter were the possible spirits of the dreaded wolf of Allendale and one of the goat victims that fell to it. Although the coincidence of what seemed to be 2 spirits would seem like it would be connected to what happened nearly 70 years prior, I myself am still hesitant to believe these 2 incidents are connected in any way. Studies and tests done on the heads over the years before their disappearances had given no definite answers on their origins, how old they were, or what had been the possible purpose they served. With Desmond Craigie coming forward claiming he had been the creator of the heads, it had put pressure on those searching to support their paranormal narrative, but seeing how the heads had mysteriously vanished somewhere, we may never find an answer to our questions until they are recovered again. As for the reported paranormal activity reported by multiple members of multiple families, we should always take these claims with a grain of salt. Now, no, I'm not going to call anybody a liar and say they didn't see what they saw, but there are possible explanations to what might have been going on here. In the case of items moving around the Robsons' home, it could have easily have been one of the children living in the home who were perpetrating these acts. It was the 1970s and people didn't have cameras inside their homes like we do now to record any poltergeist activity and then look back to watch the recordings later for any kind of proof. What I suspect is as soon as they saw their parents react to something they believed to be paranormal, one of the children in the Robsons household began moving things around at night, passing it off as a ghost or spirit. There have been numerous cases over the years of children and adults pretending a ghost was to blame for certain activity in their home. A rather famous example people like to argue is the Enfield haunting in London in 1977. Although some don't like to believe this, many point out there has been a lot of evidence of the ghostly activity in the home, pointing towards the children having been the ones who were purposefully messing with the police, investigators, and other members of their family. We'll most likely go into this case at some point in the podcast future, but my point still stands. I suspect one of the children in the Robsons' home were playing pranks on their family after seeing how scared the others would get. Now, as for the shadowy figure spotted next door in the Dodds' home, I have a feeling this was simply either just a very scary dream the mother or daughter had, or perhaps just shadows playing tricks on the eyes and mind of Mrs. Dodd and her daughter. Perhaps Mrs. Dodd was telling a scary story to her daughter at the time, and the young girl claimed to have spotted a monster in the hallway, to which her mother left to investigate. Then, once word of the hauntings next door got out, the spotting of the shadowy sheep man was exaggerated a bit and became a part of this whole mystery. For the case of Dr. Ann Ross seeing a wolf man after waking up at 2 a.m. in her bedroom, these same explanations could be true here as well. She may have dreamt about the scary shadowy figure, or perhaps after waking up, the dark shadows of the bedroom played tricks on her mind as she was still trying to wake up and still was a little disoriented. As for her daughter spotting the wolfman jump down the stairs, this could have been a case of simply seeing things. The story behind the stone heads and the activity surrounding them more than likely was something she had heard before by her mother or friends at school, which then caused her to believe the activity was brought into her house and then was active there, leading her to believe that she had seen the same creature that had possessed the heads. This line of thought could also be added to Dr. Ross's experience when she was awoken in the night to spot the figure. Perhaps the two of them were just aware of the stories behind the heads and were beginning to see things because they were a little bit paranoid. But like I said before, I don't necessarily want to call anyone in this story a liar. Perhaps it was paranoia or mistakenly seeing things at the corner of one's eye is a more logical explanation for what these heads brought on in 1971. People will believe what they want to believe, however. If they think the stone heads of Hexham are cursed and can bring forth strange half-man, half-beast creatures, then by all means, believe that narrative. It's a fun and spooky tale that has both aspects of ghostly activity and also cryptid appearances added into it. I, for one, love the story behind the heads, whether or not they are truly haunted. The history of Hexham having a legend about an unstoppable wolf predator getting loose and causing chaos over 100 years ago adds even more myth into the story behind the stone heads. Whatever you want to believe, whether the stone heads are just that, stone heads created by a man as toys to entertain his daughter, or ancient relics of the forgotten past that holds mystical powers to unleash the dead, I hope you agree that these heads are something special. Whatever their origin, I'm thankful for the brief appearance the stone heads made back in the 70s. Perhaps one day, they'll be uncovered once more, and whatever spirits that might possess them will be brought back into our world. I hope you enjoyed listening to the history and legend behind the stone heads of Hexham. As it is October, I'm hoping I'll be able to find some classic spooky stories and legends for you to listen to this year. Since it is the season of fear and terror, consider sharing the podcast with others, be that being friends, family members, or coworkers. It helps the podcast grow and encourages me to bring you more strange and macabre tales of the past, and gives a little extra creepiness for your loved ones to be entertained by. For those looking to support the podcast even further, giving the podcast a 5-star review on iTunes, or follow the Instagram at Moonlight Lore Podcast, where I post pictures relating to the episodes I talk about on here. But of course, simply by listening helps a great deal. You can also email me at moonlightlorepodcast@gmail.com if you have any suggestions of topics you might want to hear in the future, or if you simply just want to say hi. Other than that, I hope you all have a fantastic start to your spooky season. And stay tuned for more episodes coming out this month. I'll see you next time.